At the Grand Sovereign Hotel, where corridors were paved in polished marble and the air hummed with the quiet rustle of money, a billion-dollar negotiation between a British energy consortium and a formidable Arab sheikh was collapsing into chaos. The room, a penthouse suite overlooking a skyline of glass and ambition, felt suddenly small, suffocating under the weight of a single, catastrophic misunderstanding. Sheikh Rayyan al-Qasimi rose from the mahogany table, his fury a palpable force. He was a man carved from the desert itself, imposing and unyielding, his white thobe a stark contrast to the dark, tailored suits of the British delegation. He spoke in rapid, guttural Arabic, his words not merely spoken but launched like projectiles across the room. No one on the British side understood the precise meaning, only the searing temperature of his contempt. They sensed, with a sinking dread, that he had just insulted their lineage, their business, and their entire nation. With a final, dismissive gesture, he turned to leave. The deal was dead. Billions of dollars, months of planning, careers all vanishing into the abyss of a botched translation. Leland Hayes, the leader of the British team, stood paralyzed, his face the color of ash. His expensive suit suddenly felt like a costume, and his usually smug grin had melted into a mask of pure panic. Beside him, the interpreter, a nervous man whose glasses perpetually slid down his nose, was stammering apologies in English, which only served to fuel the sheikh's disdain. Just then, from a corner of the vast suite, came a sound so unexpected it seemed to break the laws of physics. It was a woman's voice, calm and clear, speaking in flawless Arabic. "Forgive their clumsiness, Your Excellency," the voice said. "The Gulf dialect is smooth as desert silk. Their intention was not to question your integrity, but to offer a guarantee of mutual prosperity." The hall froze. The torrent of the sheikh's anger ceased. He stopped mid-stride, his hand hovering inches from the gilded door handle. Slowly, deliberately, he turned. His gaze, shielded by dark sunglasses that reflected the room's crystal chandelier, swept past the stunned faces of the suited executives and landed on the source of the voice. In the corner, holding a mop with a quiet stillness, stood a woman in the plain gray uniform of the hotel's housekeeping staff. Her name was Cora Bishop. She was perhaps 26, with dark hair pulled back in a severe, functional ponytail that allowed no room for vanity. Her face was devoid of makeup, her features clear and composed. There was nothing about her that demanded attention, yet in her eyes there was a sharp, unwavering intelligence that made one look twice. She wasn't loud or flashy. She didn't carry herself like someone begging to be seen. But when she spoke, her voice held a quiet weight, a self-possession that felt ancient and unshakable. Sheikh Rayyan al-Qasimi looked at her as if he had just heard a voice from his own royal court, an echo of the precise, poetic language of his elders. He took a half-step back toward the table, his formidable presence now entirely focused on this unassuming figure. Leland Hayes's mouth hung open. His team exchanged bewildered glances. The interpreter looked as though he had just witnessed a ghost. In a room built on hierarchy and defined by titles, the sudden intervention of a cleaner was more than a disruption. It was an inversion of their entire world. For a long, breathless moment, the fate of a billion-dollar deal rested not on the shoulders of the men in power, but in the hands of the woman holding the mop. The silence that followed Cora's words was heavy and fragile, a glass bubble that no one dared to breathe on. Sheikh Rayyan's head tilted slightly, a hawk studying its prey. "You speak my tongue?" he asked, his voice low and testing, the fury replaced by a sharp, cold curiosity. Cora set her mop gently against the wall, the movement economical and without flourish. She gave a slight, respectful bow, not of servitude, but of courtesy. "I do, Your Excellency," she replied in the same flawless Arabic. "I lived in Muscat for 8 years as a child." The explanation only deepened the mystery. The room, packed with egos and ambition, didn't know what to make of her. She was an anomaly, a variable they hadn't accounted for. It was Meredith Shaw who broke the spell. A senior member of Leland's team, a woman with a sleek bob and a designer scarf knotted artfully at her neck, she leaned toward a colleague. Her whisper, however, was engineered to carry, sharp and coated in venom. "Who let the cleaning lady in here? Does she honestly think she's part of this?" A few nervous snickers rippled through the British side. Her colleague, a man with a flashy watch, added with a smirk, Perhaps she's here to mop up our mistakes. It seems we've made quite a mess." The laughter spread, low and cruel. It was the sound of an established order reasserting itself, of putting the anomaly back in its box. Cora's fingers tightened for a fraction of a second on the fabric of her apron, the only outward sign that the barbs had landed. She didn't turn. She didn't acknowledge them. Instead, she squared her shoulders, a subtle adjustment that nonetheless projected immense strength. Her eyes flickered for a moment, catching Meredith's gaze, and she spoke, her voice barely a whisper, in Arabic. "Intent matters." Meredith froze, her smirk faltering. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She had been addressed and dismissed in a language she could not comprehend, and it left her feeling suddenly powerless. Before the tension could escalate, the suite doors burst open. Preston Finch, the hotel manager, stormed in. He was a wiry man whose slicked-back hair and overly tight tie seemed to scream self-importance. His face was pale with rage, his jaw clenched. He marched directly to Cora, ignoring the sheikh and the delegation, and grabbed her arm. "What do you think you are doing?" he hissed, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You have no right to interfere. You are a housekeeper, Cora. You clean floors. You do not belong here." His finger jabbed the air, punctuating each word. The British team shifted uncomfortably, some looking at their shoes, others suddenly fascinated by their phones. This was a different kind of cruelty, not the subtle jab of a peer, but the raw, public humiliation from a superior. Sheikh Rayan watched the entire exchange, his expression unreadable, his arms crossed over his chest. Cora did not pull away. She did not argue. She simply looked at Preston Finch, her face a mask of calm, and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Under his furious glare, she turned and walked toward the door, her steps slow and deliberate. The mop remained propped against the wall, a quiet witness. As she reached the doorway, a young assistant from the sheikh's team, a man with a neatly trimmed beard, stepped forward. He cleared his throat and said in Arabic, his tone dripping with mockery, "You're leaving already? The room's not clean yet." Cora paused, her hand on the doorframe. Without turning back, she replied in the same language, her voice even and clear. "Even cleanliness begins with respect." The assistant's smile vanished. Sheikh Rayan's lips twitched, the ghost of a smile, but he remained silent. The awkward silence in the room deepened as Cora Bishop walked out, her footsteps echoing faintly in the hall. The air she left behind was thick with unspoken judgment, and the deal, once again, hung by a thread. In the wake of Cora's departure, an uncomfortable pall settled over the suite. The momentum, however briefly restored, had once again bled out, leaving behind a sour residue of embarrassment and failure. Preston Finch, puffing out his chest, straightened his tie and muttered something to Leland Hayes about maintaining professional standards. Leland, desperate for any ally, nodded vaguely, but his eyes kept darting toward the empty doorway. The interpreter, emboldened by Cora's absence, stepped forward again, shuffling his papers. "Your Excellency," he began, his voice cracking, "if I may clarify the previous point regarding the escrow protocol." But Sheikh Rayan al-Qasimi was not listening. His gaze remained fixed on the door through which Cora had disappeared. He had seen everything, the casual cruelty of the British team, the manager's petty tyranny, and most importantly, the quiet, unbending dignity of the woman in the gray uniform. He had built an empire not just on oil and assets, but on his ability to read people, to see the substance beneath the surface. And he had seen more substance in the housekeeper in 2 minutes than he had seen from the British delegation in 2 months. He raised a hand, a simple gesture that carried the weight of absolute authority. The interpreter's voice died in his throat. Every eye in the room turned to the sheikh. "Let her sit," he said. The words were low, deliberate, and utterly unambiguous. The room froze for a second time. Leland blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. Did he mean one of his own team members? He looked at Meredith, who seemed equally baffled. Preston Finch, who had been hovering near the back, stepped forward again, his face twisting in disbelief. "Sir," he began, a sycophantic smile plastered on his lips, "I assure you, she is just a staff member. She is of no importance. I have already dismissed her for her impertinence." The sheikh's gaze shifted to him. It was a look devoid of heat, yet it was so cold and sharp that Preston Finch stopped mid-sentence, his mouth snapping shut as if he'd been struck. Sheikh Ryan repeated his command, slower this time, each word dropping into the silence like a stone into a deep well. Let her sit, she will translate. There was no room for argument. This was not a request, it was a decree. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The power dynamic, so rigidly defined by suits and titles, had been shattered. For a moment, nobody moved. They were waiting for a punchline that never came. Then, one of Sheikh Ryan's own assistants, the same one who had mocked Cora just moments earlier, moved with sudden alacrity. He walked to the mahogany table, his face now a mask of professional deference, and pulled out a vacant chair, a heavy, leather-backed chair meant for a senior negotiator. The scrape of its wooden legs against the polished floor was the only sound in the room, and it echoed like a gavel, calling a new session to order. Another assistant was dispatched. He returned minutes later with Cora Bishop in tow. She walked back into the suite, her face still calm, her expression unreadable. She betrayed no surprise, no triumph, no fear. She simply walked past the astonished faces of the British team and the mortified hotel manager. She walked to the chair that had been prepared for her, between the Sheikh's delegation and Leland's, and sat down. From a pocket in her apron, she produced a small, worn notebook and a simple pen. She opened it to a clean page, her movements precise and unhurried. She looked up, met Sheikh Ryan's gaze with a steady one of her own, and gave a minute nod. She was ready. The housekeeper was now at the head of the table. The negotiation resumed, but its very nature had been transformed. The focal point of the room was no longer Leland Hayes with his slick presentations or Sheikh Ryan with his commanding presence. It was Cora Bishop, the silent woman in the gray uniform, who now held the delicate balance of the entire affair in her hands. And she was flawless. Where the previous interpreter had fumbled, Cora was precise. She didn't just carry words across a linguistic divide. She rebuilt the bridge of understanding that the first man had burned. When Leland spoke of complex financial instruments and phased investments, his language filled with corporate jargon, Cora translated it not literally, but contextually. She rendered his stiff, formal English into an elegant, respectful Arabic that conveyed partnership rather than demand. When Sheikh Ryan responded, his speech was clipped, laden with cultural nuances and subtle implications that a textbook-trained linguist would miss. He spoke of honor, of legacy, of trust built over generations. Cora captured it all. She caught the unspoken currents flowing beneath his words, the slight shift in tone that indicated a point was non-negotiable, the fractional pause that hinted at a willingness to be flexible. She didn't just translate his words. She translated his intent. Leland Hayes and his team could only watch in a state of deepening bewilderment. They were witnessing a master at work, and her mastery shamed their own lack of preparation. Leland kept stealing glances at her, his brow furrowed. He was a man who understood the world through a clear hierarchy of value. A CEO was worth more than a manager, a banker more than a secretary. Cora Bishop broke his formula. He couldn't place her. He couldn't calculate her worth, and it unnerved him profoundly. One of his team members, a woman with perfectly styled hair, leaned over and whispered, "Who is she, really?" Leland could only shake his head. During a short break for coffee, the fragile truce of professionalism was broken. Meredith Shaw, her earlier confidence now curdled into a tight, resentful smile, approached Cora as she was reviewing her notes. "You must feel so special," Meredith said, her voice dripping with honeyed venom. "Stepping in like that, a real Cinderella moment. But let's be honest, you're out of your depth, aren't you?" She tilted her head, her eyes searching for a flicker of insecurity, a crack in Cora's serene facade. Cora set her pen down, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked up at Meredith, her gaze steady and clear, holding none of the animosity she was receiving. "Depth," she said softly, her voice barely carrying above the low hum of conversation, "isn't measured by titles." Meredith's smile faltered. The simple, profound truth of the statement left her with no retort. Her fingers tightened on her designer scarf. The other British team members, who had been watching, quickly looked away, pretending to be absorbed in their own conversations. The moment passed, but a small fissure had appeared in Meredith's polished armor. Cora picked her pen up again, her focus returning instantly to her notebook, as if Meredith's words were nothing more than meaningless background noise. The negotiation moved forward, smoother now than it had ever been. By the end of the day, The framework of a deal, the very deal that had been dead on arrival that morning, was firmly in place. When the meeting concluded, Sheikh Rayyan stood, gave Cora a long, appraising look, and left without another word. The silent acknowledgement was more powerful than any spoken praise. The British team packed their briefcases, muttering about deadlines and flights. Their relief palpable, but their confusion just as strong. They had gotten what they wanted, but they had no idea how. Success, for Cora Bishop, was a fleeting and dangerous thing. She had saved the day, but in doing so, she had broken the cardinal rule of her profession. She had become visible. For people like her, visibility was not an asset. It was a liability. Her reward for bridging a billion-dollar gap was not a bonus or a promotion. It was a summons from Preston Finch. He was waiting for her in the lobby, his arms crossed, his face a blotchy red. When Cora walked by, her shift finally over, he stepped directly in her path, blocking her way. "Who do you think you are?" he snapped, his voice low and vicious. "A floor cleaner playing diplomat. You've shamed this hotel. You have made me look like a fool. We have standards here, a protocol. And you," he jabbed a finger toward her, "are a disruption to that protocol." Cora didn't answer. There was nothing to say. She had known this was coming. In his world, her competence was a greater crime than her insubordination. She reached into her apron pocket, pulled off her plastic name tag Cora, housekeeping, and set it on the polished concierge counter. The soft click of the plastic on the marble felt final, like a closing door. She bowed slightly, the same gesture of respect she had shown the sheikh, and walked away, her small notebook still clutched in her hand. A couple of wealthy guests in the lobby glanced over, their eyes soft with a detached pity for the girl being dressed down by her manager. Cora didn't look back. She moved through the grand revolving doors, her steps steady, her face unreadable. Behind her, Preston Finch was already on his phone, his voice loud and self-righteous as he spoke with human resources. "She's done here," he said, pacing. "Effective immediately. No one makes a fool of me like that." That evening, however, a message arrived at the hotel's front desk. It was an envelope of heavy cream paper, marked urgent and sealed with the handsome, intricate wax crest of Sheikh Rayyan al-Qasimi's office. The concierge, a young woman who had often seen Cora working late shifts without complaint, handed it to Preston Finch. He opened it with a smirk, expecting a formal apology for the day's chaos, perhaps even a compliment on how he'd handled his rogue employee. His face fell as he read the single, elegantly scripted line inside. "I require a private audience with the woman you call your housekeeper. Send her to my penthouse suite, now." Preston's hands shook as he folded the paper, his jaw tight. He said nothing to the staff. He just stormed off to his office, the note clutched in his fist like a losing lottery ticket. An hour later, Cora was called back to the hotel. She walked into the penthouse suite, still in her civilian clothes, expecting another lecture, perhaps a demand that she sign a non-disclosure agreement. Instead, she found Sheikh Rayyan sitting alone at a vast glass table, a small, lacquered box in front of him. The city lights twinkled below them like a carpet of fallen stars. He gestured for her to sit. She did, her hands folded calmly in her lap. He did not speak of the negotiation or the insults she had endured. He simply slid the box across the table toward her. His face was serious, his gaze direct. "Your skill," he said, "is wasted here." Inside the box was a letter, sealed not with a corporate logo, but with the national crest of the United Arab Emirates. Cora opened it, her fingers careful, as if handling something ancient and fragile. It was a formal invitation, on behalf of the Ministry of Energy, to join the official language advisory panel at the upcoming Abu Dhabi Energy Summit. It was a position reserved for the world's most elite linguists and diplomats. Sheikh Rayyan leaned back, his voice steady. "You did not just translate words today, Miss Bishop. You understood intent. You understood honor. That is a talent most of my paid advisors fail to grasp after a decade of study. It is a talent I am willing to pay for." The Abu Dhabi Energy Summit was a different world. It was a universe of crisp suits, hushed and important conversations, and the ambient pressure of global economies hanging in the balance. Cora Bishop walked into the main conference hall, her plain black dress and simple shoes drawing more than a few curious stares from the polished crowd. She was an unknown quantity, and in a world that ran on reputation, that made her an object of suspicion. Before the first session began, a journalist, a woman with sharp red lipstick and an even sharper smile, approached her. "So, you're the maid who got lucky?" she said, her pen poised over her notepad. Her smile was more of a smirk. "Care to comment on how you charmed your way into a position like this?" The question hung in the air, sharp and loaded, designed to provoke a reaction. Cora set her notebook on the table, the same worn notebook from the hotel, its pages now filled with complex terminologies of energy policy. Her movements were, as always, deliberate. She looked at the journalist, her eyes calm but unflinching. "Charm doesn't speak languages," she said. "Work does." The journalist's pen stopped. Her smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of surprise. The other reporters nearby, who had been listening in, shifted their weight, their murmurs quieting. Cora had not taken the bait. She had refused to play their game. She turned back to her notes, her focus absolute, leaving the journalist standing there, momentarily silenced. But the challenges were not confined to the media. They came from within the circle she now inhabited. At a preparatory meeting for the interpreters, a man named Julian, a veteran linguist with a crisp suit and a condescending air, made a point of acknowledging her arrival. "Ah, so you're the housekeeper everyone's talking about," he said, his voice loud enough to turn heads. He leaned back in his chair, a smug look on his face. "Must be nice to skip the line. Some of us had to spend decades in academia to get here." The other interpreters glanced at each other. Some smirked in solidarity with Julian. Others looked away, embarrassed but unwilling to intervene. Cora set her bag down. She opened her notebook and looked directly at the man, her expression calm. "Lines don't matter," she said, her voice even. "Accuracy does." Julian scoffed, but his confidence wavered when the session began. They were given a complex technical document to translate on site, a test of their abilities. Julian, for all his experience, struggled with the dense, modern terminology, but Cora's voice was steady, her pronunciation flawless. She moved through the document with an ease that spoke not of luck, but of countless hours of solitary, disciplined study. The room's attention shifted, the smirks faded. Her expertise filled the space, quiet but undeniable, leaving no room for doubt. Even her own family, during a brief visit back to the United States, viewed her new life with skepticism. Seated around her aunt's kitchen table, the air thick with the smell of coffee, her relatives listened to her story. "You just got lucky, is all," her cousin said, tapping her acrylic nails on the table. "Right place, right time." Her uncle nodded, his baseball cap pulled low. "Don't get cocky, Cora. It's not like you earned it through a proper career. A fluke is a fluke." Cora just smiled, her hands wrapped around her warm mug. She didn't argue. She didn't try to explain the years of self-study, the nights spent poring over books on linguistics and Middle Eastern culture while her peers were out socializing. She knew they wouldn't understand. Later, on the flight back to the UAE, she sat with her notebook open, already working. Pages were filled with notes on 3 new languages she was learning, scribbled in neat, precise rows. She had never stopped working, never stopped learning. That was her secret. It wasn't luck. It was devotion. The OPEC summit was the true test. Here, the stakes were not just billions, but trillions. The political and economic futures of nations were debated and decided. When Cora Bishop walked into the main chamber, she was not an afterthought or an anomaly. She walked in at the head of Sheikh Ryan Al Qasimi's advisory delegation. Her dress was still simple, her hair still tied back, but the room shifted when she entered. The same British team was there, including Leland Hayes. His smile was tighter now, less smug. He stood to greet her, his handshake quick, his eyes avoiding hers. He and his team had heard whispers of her new position, and the reality of seeing her there, not as a servant but as a peer, and a highly valued one at that, was a bitter pill to swallow. Sheikh Ryan arrived last, his presence filling the space. He took his seat at the head of the table and gave a single, decisive nod at Cora. The summit began. Throughout the intense, multi-day negotiations, she was his voice and his ears. She translated with the same effortless precision, her calm presence, a steadying influence in a room fraught with tension. During a break, a reporter cornered her, his microphone pushed too close to her face. "How does a hotel maid rise this far, this fast?" he asked, his tone sharp. fishing for a sensational story of intrigue or romance. Cora looked at him, her eyes calm. "I never saw that job as beneath me," she said simply. "I saw it as a place to work, and wherever language exists, there is value." The reporter blinked, his pen pausing. He had expected a fairy tale, but he was given a lesson in dignity. He scribbled it down. At the summit's closing dinner, a senior executive from the British team, a man with gray hair and a heavy gold watch, approached Cora as she stood by the dessert table. "You've done well for yourself," he said, his voice smooth but condescending. "A remarkable story, but let's not pretend this isn't a fairy tale. Such things don't last." His smile was thin, his eyes cold. Cora set her plate down, her movements deliberate. She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "Fairy tales end," she said. "Work doesn't." The executive's smile froze. He stood there, holding his glass of champagne, as Cora walked away, her presence unshaken. A week later, Reuters published a feature article. The headline was bold and unambiguous. "Sheikh Rayyan Al Qasimi declares Cora Bishop is my senior advisor and the reason. I'm investing $2 billion in the U.S." The piece quoted the sheikh directly, his words blunt. "She understands what others miss," he was quoted as saying. "She hears the silence between the words. In my world, that is worth more than money." The story sent ripples through the financial world. Investors and corporations began to take notice. Dozens requested meetings with Cora Bishop, their emails piling up. She didn't gloat. She didn't post about it on social media. She just kept working, her notebook always closed, her pen always moving. Back at the Grand Sovereign Hotel, things had changed. Preston Finch, the manager, was quietly let go. There was no announcement, just a new, more humble face at his desk. Meredith Shaw, after word spread about her team's fumble in Dubai, lost a major promotion she had been counting on. Leland Hayes' consortium lost a subsequent contract to a rival, their reputation for cultural incompetence now a quiet stain on their record. No one said Cora's name in those stories, but the truth was there, heavy and undeniable, a quiet consequence for their loud arrogance. Cora Bishop didn't look back. She didn't need to. Her steps were steady, her path now clear. The world had shifted around her, not because she had demanded it, but because she had never stopped being herself. Her silence had never been weakness. It was strength, carved out of years of being underestimated. She kept walking, her notebook in her bag, her eyes on the next summit, the next language, the next moment waiting to be understood. The people who had judged her, mocked her, and dismissed her were still talking, still trying to explain her away with words like luck and fluke. But their words didn't matter anymore. The truth did, and it was finally loud enough for the world to hear.